Well, good morning, everyone. How are you? As we kind of begin to embark on this journey into the mark of a Christian, I think you'll find that this particular book is pretty moving. This is actually my favorite book by Francis Schaeffer for a lot of different reasons, and I'm going to kind of go into a lot of the background and stuff today to kind of give you a good solid introduction. If you don't know me already, my name is Dan Guinn, and I operate a website called FrancisSchaefferStudies.org, and it's really our desire to introduce the works of Francis Schaeffer to the next generation, as well as make his thought and teachings more accessible for general inquiry. And we're doing that in a lot of ways, through an online database. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of Schaeffer, if you will. And I was beginning to work with scholars this year. We just did a Francis Schaeffer Centennial, celebrating Francis Schaeffer's 100th birthday. So we're doing a lot in this area. And specifically, when we were asked about the mark of a Christian, I was just thoroughly excited to be able to teach it, because, and not only because it's my favorite book, but also because it's a very significant work. And so let me just give you a general introduction. The Mark of a Christian is a small but significant booklet written by Francis Schaeffer, which was published in 1970. It is Francis Schaeffer's sixth book, and perhaps its most notable features are that it's incredibly concise, just 38 pages, and yet it's also deeply profound. You get the sense that Schaeffer wanted to clearly hammer home this point. The concept that Schaeffer is trying to convey is the proper balance of truth and love. Now, some of you, you may have heard that phrase floated around quite a bit, but Schaeffer gets into the heart of it in a very deep way, and it's pretty moving. So, now you may be asking yourself, how are we going to do a 13-week class on just a 38-page book? I believe that you will find that although the concept of truth and love is simple, the application can be extremely overwhelming, and we really need the aid of the Holy Spirit. And so there's plenty of content to cover as we examine the subject from many different angles. And although we have thought about coupling the teaching of this book with another book, I felt very passionately we need to spend the whole time on the mark of a Christian, and as the work is just too important. And so let me take a moment to explain the reasoning behind this, give you some sort of history and background. The subject matter of this book is the number one thing that Schaeffer taught that the church regularly ignores in practice. Schaeffer mentions this concept over 130 times in his works. The concept of truth and love, 130 times. And the concept of truth and love is really the answer, or his answer, to the obstacles of life that are regularly plaguing us, and we are really robbing ourselves of the power of Christ to overcome them. And another thing here is that the world is watching. The world is watching. What will we show them? The book that is the good next step from Schaeffer's Mark of a Christian is The Church Before the Watching World, which is the book that we consider teaching along with the Mark of a Christian. And the title really says it all, that the church before the watching world. Now, the concept of truth and love is really the basis of Francis Schaeffer's apologetic for religious liberalism. It's absolutely essential, really, that we learn it. And I think it's so important. Listen to this quote by Brian Follis in his work called Truth and Love, the Apologetics of Francis Schaeffer. And I have a copy of it here so you can actually see what it looks like. Brian Follis does a really excellent job. And one of the things he says, indeed it is crucial, if we are to gain an insight into Schaeffer and his apologetic, that we grasp the depth of his love for the individual. It was a belief that had not only shaped him, but his entire ministry. And so it's very significant for us to examine this concept because of its importance to Schaeffer, but also the value that he places on it. And I think you'll see that it's huge. Now, Schaeffer believed that the Mark of the Christian was to be one of his most important works. From his various writings, it seems obvious that he would have placed it within the top 5 books he ever wrote. likely True Spirituality might be his #1 book, and then maybe the God Who Is There would be the second, or maybe the entire trilogy, and then a close examination, possibly his basic Bible studies, which were the teaching of the concepts of true spirituality and the mark of a Christian, really in the setting of L'Abri. And so these are very significant, but the thing about the mark of a Christian is that it really covers what permeated the whole of Schaeffer's teaching. It was kind of a basis and foundation undergirding a lot of his concepts and approach to true spirituality. So it was significant in that the concept of truth and love is foundation to all that Schaeffer wrote and did. And as I mentioned earlier, he mentioned it, the concept 130 times at least. There's other times when there's references to it in different ways. And it's really foundational to Schaeffer's core worldview. So it's integrated into everything he taught. Now, as I mentioned, I talked just briefly or mentioned the word L'Abri. Now, if you don't know about L'Abri, let me explain very quickly what it is. If you haven't heard about L'Abri, Francis Schaeffer and his wife Edith went to Switzerland, and they became missionaries, and really their work was about reaching out to young people. And at first they were just doing a work called Children for Christ. It's work that they started in St. Louis and eventually became international. And then after World War II, they were asked by a missionary board to go and strengthen that which remains, and specifically minister to children and who were suffering in war-torn Europe. And the situation there was very harsh, very, very poor. And so he was very active, both he and Edith, in addressing these things. But as Schaeffer toured, he realized that there was a problem, both in the condition of children, but also the condition of the thought in the church. And so he began to directly reply to liberalism. So when they would travel, he and Edith, Schaeffer would lecture against the ideas and concepts of liberalism, and Edith, on the other hand, would share about how to minister to children in very distinct ways and raise them up. And so they had this wonderful ministry. But over time, what began to happen is that there were more schisms in the church here in the United States, over kind of infighting, if you will, and separation within those who had separated. So people who had separated from the liberal church had begun to infight within themselves and had broken off into various denominations, and there was more fighting and things like this. And finally, Schaeffer had just had enough. He said, where's the reality? Where's the truth in this situation? And so when he withdrew, a lot of the core struggles that he went through during that time brought about the concepts and teachings that are true spirituality. But then what happened is that L'Abri began to be formed into a organization. What actually happened is when they separated from the denomination, they resigned, they took a step of faith, and God provided miraculously. And you can read about this in Edith's book, L'Abri. There's a very distinct way he provided for them and provided a place for this ministry to start. And they founded this ministry on 3 important core concepts. Firstly, honest answers to honest questions, which is really truth, right? The practice of hospitality, which is really to them an outward demonstration of visible love. And it's just one way that we can apply it, but it's one distinct way in which they used it. They used beauty, they used hospitality to convey that God existed. And then also, they begin to function and act in the role of a life of prayer. Their goal was to demonstrate to others that God could provide and that He was real. And so they would pray for things, and from all over the world would drop in and live with Him for a week or two, and they're witnessing these prayers being answered right in front of them, and then they could see, okay, well, I don't know if there's anything to this Christianity, but these people are real, and for whatever reason, the circumstances seem to be going their way because they're praying to their God, and He's answering these prayers. So maybe, just maybe, there is a God. Maybe there is hope. And people would, the longer they stayed there, they began to soak up that environment, soak up that hospitality, and realize that these people really cared about them. And one of the stories I love to tell is the story of Sylvester Jacobs, who was a black man from Oklahoma, a Christian, but he was kind of marginalized, very much so in the United States of the 60s. And so he came to L'Abri, hoping to really kind of figure out, if there's anything substantial here. And actually, he met Schaeffer at a conference, and Schaeffer separated himself from the group that he was standing talking to and went distinctly over to this man, and began to talk to him very personally, and then asked him to come to L'Abri. And then when he came to L'Abri, one of the things that he realized is that these people care about me. Imagine being a black person in the 60s and somebody's making your bed for you. How odd that would feel. He'd never had that happen before. Somebody was actually extending love to him in a very real way and demonstrating truth and love. And so what happened is that he realized that if these people care about me, maybe perhaps God cares about me. Huge. But that's that little step that truth and love can impact in the person's heart. Now, to Schaeffer, this whole thing was part of a living and breathing, interactive apologetic. You could have not really have had one without the other. And one of the quotes that I share quite often, which I heard that Schaeffer had said during a lecture, is, "Truth without love is ugly, yet love without truth is compromise." And this really kind of sums up the whole of this book. Truth without love is ugly. Love without truth is compromise. Now, I really think it's no mistake that in the year after his book, that Edith would soon publish her work on hospitality called The Hidden Art of Homemaking, Creative Ideas for Enriching Everyday Life, and that Schaeffer would also that next year publish True Spirituality and Church Before the Watching World. The Schaeffers were constantly trying to assert this larger macro level concept into a very everyday thinking, and they applied that to all their works. So their whole of their works was really to apply the Lordship of Christ to the whole of life, and they saw that as by applying the principle of truth and love. It's an add-on, really. Let me show you this booklet. It's an introduction to Francis Schaeffer, a study guide to the trilogy. And then in this book, at the very end, there is How I Come to Write My Books by Francis Schaeffer. And so what's neat about Schaeffer is that if you go and you study enough, usually he's told you in some of his appendices or some of his forwards or other related works, he's told you why he wrote things and what was going on. So he's fun to research because he's very well documented. And if you know anything about his wife Edith, she was sort of the historian. She wrote letter after letters. There's 2 big volumes of letters that she wrote. And so you can go and you can really listen to read everything about what happened for the most part. And now there's a quote here where he says, "The church at the end of the 20th century moved into other areas of application, sociology and ecclesiology. The 2 appendices to that book, Adultery and Apostasy and The Mark of the Christian, also published as a separate book, picked up the theme and touched on in the second appendix to The God Who's There." Now, I'll clarify all this in a little bit, but they emphasize the balance to be struck between the practice of purity in the visible church and the love which ought to mark relationships between all Christians. No matter what their differences are, there is also a fuller and practical treatment of ecclesiology in the Church Before the Watching World. Okay, so he's commenting in that little segment, How I Come to Write My Books. He's saying, everything I've been doing has been to push forward this idea. Schaeffer comments also a bit later that after a series of books had been covered, that this real concept began to come to light. There's a balance that had been achieved. And he says, "At this point in my writing and publishing, I felt that a balance had finally been achieved between Edith and myself, books emphasizing both the intellectual and the practical aspects of the Christian life had been produced." So this was what was moving forward. Now, Schaeffer further proves that there's an importance of the Mark of the Christian by the amount of times the work is actually published. It's not just published one time. So that's also rather interesting. It was first published by itself via InterVarsity in 1970. and it's published as an essay form later in Christianity Today in September 11th, 1970. And then he also published it in the appendix to The Church at the End of the 20th Century. And then finally also in his last work, The Great Evangelical Disaster, published by Crossway in 1984. So Schaeffer kept putting this thing out there. Obviously, I want you guys to get this. It's so important. And so that's what he kept doing. And you'll see kind of there's just that grand significance that it begins to play. While a lot of people seem to know about the mark of the Christian, the topic itself is perhaps the most overlooked or misunderstood concept among Christians. And even a percentage of those who have actually read Schaeffer get this thinking wrong. For example, many have overemphasized Schaeffer's cultural apologetic without any love. If I had a dollar for every time I met a Schaefferite who missed this concept, I might be a wealthy man. Yet, what is even more perplexing is that I have to admit that I myself would owe some money. Because it's something that has to come about through sanctification and the work of the Holy Spirit. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more. But there's really been multiple times in my life when I've failed to grasp this concept myself. Because it comes up in everyday situations. We're not always practicing truth and love in the proper balance. To understand why this is, let me just elaborate on some of the reasons why this trips people up. First off is perspective. First, people tend to approach Schaeffer from various entry points. Some have been introduced to him via his films. Some have come to know him from his early works, such as The God Who Was There or Escape from Reason. Others have visited L'Abri. Some have focused in on studying only his apologetics or his cultural analysis, and usually that's the people who read The God Who Was There. Still others have only took interest in Schaeffer's perspective on politics and abortion. So people coming in toward later years of his life, a lot of his writings actually focused on some of that stuff, but that wasn't his core thrust. It never was. It is unfortunate that there are few who understand really the entire body of his work. And again, however, for those who understand Schaeffer, the concept of the truth of love is really truly at the heart of everything he wrote. Now the next thing is that I think trips people up is spiritual discernment. Many people realize that the concept is there, but do not grasp it. They'll say truth and love, but really not apply it in a very real way. Beyond the perspective problems that people have, the greater problem is one that Jesus mentioned quite often. He who has an ear, let him hear. We think about that, but it's how do we hear truth? Sometimes it just takes the aid of the Holy Spirit. To a certain degree, the natural man can understand truth. But to apply something deep and heartfelt that's real, that is a characterization that Jesus gives of the Christian, it requires the aid of the Holy Spirit. So the reason why so many do not understand the principle of truth and love is simply that one has not been walking in the Spirit or has truly not been able to take that to heart. And I, for one, am certain that myself and others have said the words truth and love many times, and yet went long periods of time before cluing into the need to actually apply them to life in a real and significant ways. Let me give you just an obvious example. What about in the home? How many times have us men responded harshly to our wives and yet not clothe that with love? How many times have we not put on self-control, exercise the demonstration of truth by saying it in a better, more proper way than not actually, speaking into their lives in a way that is derogatory? And so I think about this constantly, and it's become actually a key, I would say personally, between some of the counseling that I've been through here at this church through Pastor Nathan, and actually through reading Schaeffer. Over many years, this has really cultivated a wonderful relationship between me and my wife, because it's aided me constantly. And so I'll ask you to keep that in mind. Another thing is sanctification. For some reason, in spirituality, we do not get things that God intends for us to understand all at once. You may remember the stories of Jesus talking to the apostles. I have many things to tell you, but not yet. And so he worked that with his apostles, and we're going through Mark and church, and you may have noticed, oh, how dense are these guys? Are they not picking up this concept? Yeah, but we've been sitting in it for a long time, and it was all brand new right then. And so over time, the Lord worked with them. And so, but it's so easy to trip up here. As Schaeffer points out in True Spirituality, it is not possible to say, read so many chapters of the Bible every day and you will get this much sanctification. It just doesn't work that way. It's a process of God dethroning those things that are in our way. We learn a truth and apply it in one area while we completely miss the same application in another too. Have you ever noticed that? In fact, we will completely ignore altogether in this different place until someone or the Holy Spirit points out our hypocrisy. This is why it is possible to be loving and truthful on Sunday in church and be angry and violent on Friday in the home. It's very easily accessible to us to step outside the bounds of that mark of a Christian. So what Schaeffer wishes to teach us is that sanctification should be consistently applied to the whole of life. That's total truth. And the words that a phrase that he used quite often, true truth and true love. Those applications are what we're seeking in this class.